Yeah.
So the idea that there's human rights, and the fact that you can interpret, for example, the human rights document any which way, even if you adopt the United Nations kind of concoction there, it could be interpreted in so many ways that so many countries actually signed up to it only because it was so broad or or allowed so much variation that they could get away with whatever they were believing in the first place.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, everybody. Welcome back. We have a very, very esteemed and special guest here with us today, Abdullah Andalusi, who needs no introduction, but among other things, involved with I3. And I learned that, alhamdulillah, it looks like we'll both get the opportunity to meet each other in person this fall at the I3 conference in Canada, and also the co-founder of the Muslim Debate Initiative, an initiative that I've benefited tremendously from. And I think everybody, if you haven't heard of it, that you should benefit tremendously from. Welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Barakallahu feekum for your invitation, brother. And inshallah, I look forward to going over there of the pond, that we can have many discussions over at Tim Hortons. We don't have many Tim Hortons here in UK, so I do appreciate the chances.
I'll take advantage of all of the rarities. Yeah. Excellent. So to get started, the main discussion today, I think, is about human rights. Both of us just happen to have released content on human rights. I had a discussion on human rights at ICNA that I gave. Actually, it was kind of more of a workshop where I tried to deconstruct it, and then more recently sort of doing various things. But before we get into that, I wanted to talk about your wonderful organization, the Muslim Debate Initiative. And we were talking offline a little bit about how the forces of secularism, they attempt to turn our Islam and how we relate to Islam into a very private matter, a very private affair. And so it de-emphasizes all of those things that are fard kifaya, that are community obligations, that every single person is sinful for if no one or not enough people are doing it, right? And it gets us to focus exclusively on sort of the, your prayer and your fasting and your charity, all wonderful things, all important and essential things to Islam, but things that if we have only the fard ayn, our Islam is not fully established. So I'd like for you, if possible, to just talk briefly about the Muslim Debate Initiative specifically, or debate in general, or the idea of sort of intellectually representing and defending Islam, and where does it fit in with the fard kifaya lens?
Sure. Well, I mean, look, the history of Muslim Debate Initiative was initially just a bunch of Muslims who were already doing debates individually. And we noticed that there were some Muslims, mashallah, very enthusiastic, well-intentioned brothers, but they perhaps weren't suited to do debates. And so what we tried to do is we kind of tried to bring together brothers who you could, and some sisters who were debaters too, in a kind of almost a peer-reviewed manner, of when we see that person performs well in debates, then we kind of say, well, let's be part of this organization that in some way can help lead by example and do kind of quality control on Muslim debating, and because we realized that many non-Muslims would pick specific opponents for debate that would make them look good and would make them appear to be really clever, very knowledgeable. And one of the problems with that is that this then does a disservice to Islam, because you're getting someone who is not necessarily the best person to do debates, being given a platform by non-Muslims. So they were picking who represents Islam. It was non-Muslims who are doing so. And they do this all the time with the media as well. Yeah. The media will often pick someone a Muslim they know would fulfill the expectations of what they want the Muslim to fulfill in a certain platform. So that's what we kind of started up, the Muslim Debate Initiative, to kind of give a platform to debaters who were very good. Now I want to say that, because many other Muslim du'at who were very good debaters, they had other organizational commitments. They didn't want to like join another organization, what have you, or bring some confusion to kind of who they were with, because they wanted to promote one, which is totally fine, but it was just an attempt anyway by some of us to do so. And it was simply judged on, Can a person is a person doing debates based on ego, or are they doing it based on fi sabilillah? And we try to filter out as best as possible, looking at decorum, adab, research, and how they approach things. Now, I suppose to explain why debates and why not just people say speaking to somebody and giving them da'wah. Well, if you meet somebody who is, you could say, open-minded enough, such that they're not restricted by the cultural upbringing they had, and viewing it as absolute dogmas, but they are so open-minded that they're willing to consider that the dogmas that they were raised with are not necessarily true, then fine, there's no need for a debate. But as soon as you encounter anyone on the street, your fellow co-worker, online, in the Twitter comments, God forbid, or anywhere where you, as soon as someone disagrees with the message that you're calling to, and you have to help them overcome the assumptions which they have adopted, which act as the roadblock in their minds for preventing them from seeing the truth, that's a debate. It's you could say, my colleague Hamza Zortzes used to call it dialectical da'wah, right? But it's really just, you have to overcome their assumptions. And, as I mentioned before, the Quranic verses were intended to be used in Makkah. Many of them, not all, many of them were intended to be used as polemics against the shirk deen of the Quraysh. It was rebutting them, it was refuting them, it was pointing out the inconsistencies in their beliefs while advancing the Islamic worldview.
And some of them actually begin with qul, right? So it's actually it's a divine command to say this to others. I think that strengthens your point, that if it were simply Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala informing us about these inconsistencies or the weaknesses in these sorts of systems, then one could maybe get away with the interpretation that, well, that was just meant to inform and not meant to challenge. But some of these things, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you to say it to somebody else, which kind of establishes the necessity to bring forth the word to somebody else, and maybe in a debate-like scenario.
Yeah, I mean, I often point out that you could almost say that the Shahadatain is it starts off with polemics, la ilaha, and then illallah. So there's no, it first refutes the falsehood. There is no false idols, no human being who should be worshipped, no animal, no creature, no celestial object, no set of values or morals which are man-made or concocted from the minds of man that should be worshipped, that should be our criterion, our furqan. There's nothing that should be the basis for human life and meaning other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there's nothing else that exists with such absoluteness as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is no other absolute except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is, the Shahada begins with almost like a polemic. It's clearing, when you want to arrange your room or clear your room, you first vacuum it, you clean it, and then you and then you put the things that need to be put there in their position, in their right place. So a bit of cleaning needs to happen first, and then before you posit, or while you're positing the correct truth. So in essence, like we all do debates in every arena, whether as soon as you disagree with someone, or you're having a negotiation with somebody, or you're simply just telling your neighbor, could you just park your car a bit to the left because I want to put or what have you, right? If you park on the street, that's where debating comes in. That's simply what it is. But in the West, there is something. Well, it wasn't only in the West, but there's something of a phenomenon called formal debates, where you have an audience and you have two interlocutors, and they're discussing with each other. And, many Muslims look at it superficially and say, well, why are you doing this? Because the other person's not going to change their mind. And I often say, but it's not about the other person.
Right.
It's an educational tool to teach the audience. You like a court case, you make the audience the jury, but you need to have a defense lawyer and a prosecution lawyer to make the best case for both sides. Then the audience can make that decision for themselves while they see the evidence to hand. So that's basically why I saw there was a little niche for the necessity to engage in this area of da'wah, because many people will not listen to Islamic teachings, or non-Muslims I'm referring to. They won't bother to look at Muslim websites or go to lectures. And I'll give you a typical example. In many universities I'm invited to, when I am invited to do a lecture, or any of my colleagues in Da'wah are invited to do a lecture, maybe the audience is packed out, but full of Muslims.
Yes.
You might get a handful, you can count them usually on one hand, of non-Muslims that might be in attendance. But you do a debate at a university, and it is, you'll get 50-50 at least, Muslim, non-Muslim, who never would have turned up had it not been for it being advertised as a debate. And not in my debate, but the debate that MDI did before this with my colleague Zakir Hussain, debating a Christian called Dr. Michael Brown at the University College London, which is a college of the University of London. The audience was majority Christian, right? Actually, the Muslims were count the hand. The Christians came early, and unfortunately, current day Muslim time, unfortunately as it is, was a bit. They came late, and the seats were mostly taken up by Christians. So, subhanallah, majority Christians, they would never have turned up if we had made that into a lecture.
Sure.
And they would never have watched a YouTube video if it had been just a lecture. So we found it as a very efficacious way of bringing non-Muslims into contact with Islam.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, so yeah, I mean, just to drive your point home further, so there's a performance aspect, especially to formal debate. There's a performance aspect where it's not even necessarily anymore about trying to change your direct interlocutor's opinion, though of course that would be wonderful if we could. But it's almost the main point, or at least the more likely target would be people in the audience. Maybe they're on the fence. Maybe they haven't heard anything for a while, anything from this particular perspective. Now they're able to access it in a way that they probably otherwise wouldn't have. And, it's really, I think, also a testament to, it's almost like we have this thing within Islam where we're permitted to adopt cultural forms of other cultures as long as they don't explicitly contradict the Sharia, right? So, for example, poetry, right? Permissible to utilize poetry as a form, as a medium, in order to communicate Islamic values. We see in North America we have spoken word and sort of things like that. And debate, this at least formal debate, is a cultural form. It's something that has a tradition, in the West, especially in the UK, and it goes back, and it has rules, and it has sort of expectations to it. And so this is kind of another example of using a localized cultural form in an Islamic way in order to do Islamic da'wah. And I think that that's really fascinating.
Well, it's interesting you say that. I want to make a quick point.
Yes.
In the Quraysh in Mecca, obviously before they converted to Islam, of course, before the Fath, they had this cultural form, and not just the Quraysh, Arabs generally at the time, poetry and saj'a, especially rhymed prose. And if you're going to make an argument, if you're going to insult someone's tribe and magnify the glories of your tribe or your clan against them, or make anything, make any kind of argument, especially persuasive ones, you would do it in saj'a, you do it, using various forms of poetry. There, persuasive speech. It was viewed by Arabs as, if you want to persuade someone, you do it in this very melodic sense. And the Quran comes in like a wrecking ball,
right,
and smashes the limitations of man-made saj'a, and it just does things which is not possible, which no Arabs previously thought you just couldn't do it in Arabic, maybe not even in human language, and it does it with a powerful argument attached to it.
Yeah,
both its literary style, as well as its the meaning contained within it, just demolished the falsehoods of the Quraysh. It just really overpowered them. Their minds were blown, and they had to react in very irrational ways. The only thing they could say really usually is, "Oh, this is just magic. It is brainwashing you. It is affecting your mind." So that was, you could say, the Quran itself is an evidence of this, that it takes something which was deemed to be the best means of communication at the time, the best means of rhetoric, the best means of persuasiveness, and it just surpassed anything that humans could come up with. It took them on their game, and it just showed them that it far surpasses anything that they could ever produce. So I take inspiration from how the Quran does that, and of course, as Muslims, the inspiration we could take from the Quran is when we do da'wah is to be mubin, right? To be clear, to be persuasive. We can never match the eloquence of the Quran, but in essence, we should try to argue with wisdom, with hikmah, and of course, fair speech, as the Quran tells us to do.
And baligha, right? And Allah in Surah An-Nisa, I believe he uses the adjective baligha to like a concise and convincing and sort of I don't know how we would translate that, but something that is going to be effective, right? Effective. And I don't want to get too far afield here, but another argument for this is about the sunnah of Allah when it comes to sending messengers, right? He takes the forms of knowledge or the cultural forms that each society is best at, and just as you said, like with the Quran, comes as a wrecking ball, transcends, surpasses, and completely dominates that field. So if you look at the Bani Israel at the time of Isa alayhi salam, right, it was medicine, and so the nature of the miracles of Isa alayhi salam were medical miracles, right? But they far surpassed anything that any medicine could do. He's bringing people back from the dead. He's healing lepers, everything. Musa at the time, Musa alayhi salam, was magic. And so the miracles that he were given were surpassing any sort of magic that they had known. And so there is something of a dawah tactic there that has to do with analyzing your culture and seeing what are the sort of predominant forms that people are engaged in, what do they take pride in, whether it's to be somebody who is a poet or a debater or this sort of academic or whatever it is, and then to not just match it but surpass it. We definitely have, I think we're on solid ground when we're sort of engaging in dawah that way.
Yep. But I'd like to give two conditions. It's not about doing da'wah. Now, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, even if you know one ayah, convey it. Okay, that's fine. But you can't go beyond the remit of your knowledge when it comes to da'wah. And many du'at sometimes feel pressured to do so on a public platform. And what I would say is that, look, anyone, if you do even know one ayah, you can propagate it, but you can't, if you only know one ayah, so to speak, then don't go beyond that and simply relay it as is. And if someone asks you a question you don't know, it's not hard. You don't lose the debate by saying that, look, I haven't studied that in that particular depth. This is the first time I'm hearing of it, but I know friends of mine or colleagues of mine that do know. So inshallah, I will go ask them and I'll get back to you after the debate. I'll publish something online. I'll respond to that point simply because I don't know, but they know. So you don't relinquish the point. You don't say that your opponent has got a point over you, because no one will blame you if you as an individual just don't know the answer. Right? They'll blame Islam if it looks like Islam doesn't have the answer. So if you make a delineation between Islam and yourself to your opponents and so on and so forth. And as Imam Malik said, half of wisdom is saying, I don't know. Right? So there's no shame to say I don't know. So anyone can give da'wah as long as you restrict it to what you know for absolute certain, and you don't speculate, you don't go beyond that remit, because non-Muslims, even in interpersonal discussions you have, I'm not talking about formal debates, but just like with your co-workers, your friends, your neighbors, or what have you, no one's going to say, well, look, if you don't answer all my questions right now, I will never come back to discussing with Islam with you. Say, no, they will wait. Oh, okay, come back to me then. I want to have an answer for this. So there's no problem with doing that. But also the other limitation I'd say is that if a Muslim is prone to conflating again Islam with their own self, such that if they are not seen, if they seem to be caught out by their opponent, or their opponent makes personal attacks, they need to understand that your opponent really doesn't hate you in particular. They might have an issue with Islam out of ignorance or out of kufr, whatever motivates them. it's not you personally. Especially many of these debates, they just meet you the first time, but they might hate what you represent, or they're angry about what they perceive you represent. So never take things personally. If you have the haqq, it is their problem with the haqq, is their problem. It's not a problem with you. But if you react by taking personal offense, then you have the problem. And that is something I'd like to warn people. So there's no problem going to debates as long as you stick to your lane. Don't go beyond what you know. And if you're asked anything, never, ever, ever speculate. Right? As the Quran says, "Dhan does not avail adhan." Speculation or doubt does not avail against the truth.
Yeah. Extremely important points, Barakallahu Feekum. One last sort of thought or maybe clarification for those not familiar with the Muslim Debate Initiative or your work. Do you do sort of inter-Muslim or more sectarian debates, or are you focused mostly on non-Muslims and maybe people who are maybe even ascribe themselves to Islam but are very, very far afield? Should we be sort of, is there a proportionality at play? Like, where should most of our energy go when we're talking about debate?
I'd say, in my personal opinion, and I want to say this is my opinion, as in I could be wrong. And so I differentiate from when I report facts, like in this year, this thing happened, or that's a factual claim, but and this is my opinion. I think currently a lot of the Muslim world isn't mature enough for inter-Muslim debates. It usually ends up with rancor, insults, sometimes even takfir. And I'm not talking about between Sunnis and Ibadis and Shia. I'm talking about amongst Sunnis even.
Right.
And so I try to avoid that because I don't see much benefit in it, considering that our problems are far larger than these discussions. Now, of course, for some people, debating Asma or Sifat, for example, and the nature of it is the biggest issue for them. They think, well, if you don't take our position on this, this is kufr and what have you. So they would say it's a matter of kufr. But you see, I kind of stick with the ijma as a da'i. I stick with the ijma of the classical scholars, and I make as my limitation what the Sahabas had ijma upon and what the classical scholars had ijma upon. So the classical scholars never had ijma upon the debates on things like the Asma Sifat. And so if I'm going to wade in as a non-scholar, as a lay person, that's very presumptuous of me to start to argue with full confidence when people far, far beyond me had different positions on the matter. I will simply say I confess my ignorance, and I can't engage in that with any kind of confidence due to my ignorance. So, and the classical scholars have often said that the laymen of different sides of these discussions are not to be condemned as kuffar or what have you, because it is beyond their knowledge, these matters. So that's really where I stick that position, which might be controversial because many lay people want to wade into these debates as if they're the ones that are going to resolve something that wasn't resolved for 1,300 years between people far more qualified than themselves. So I'm not saying that people can't discuss it. It's great. We should discuss everything. I'm simply saying that I will confess my ignorance to the matter, even though I've read quite substantially in this because I'm a very, very curious mind and I read as much. But I confess my ignorance, and so I don't enter those subjects which are a matter of ikhtilaf. But as a da'i, I've limited myself to only those things where there is ijma'. I make two exceptions on the matter. One is, of course, I am someone from Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, so I won't be advocating, for example, a Shia concept of khilafah or which is an Islamic governance that all Muslims are meant to be under, and I won't be arguing, the Ibadi conception of rulers and things like this, because they deem that maybe if a ruler commits a major sin, then they've left Islam.
Right.
So I'm from Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. So I have to say, well, look, the majority precedence of Muslim history was a Sunni caliphate system, and to some extent, it was under Hanafi conceptions of how to deal with Ahl al-Dhimma and things like this. So that's where I might step and say, well, look, because these were applied in the past practically, and it was majority Hanafi fiqh, I will attempt to discuss some of those things, even if I might not follow those particular schools of thought in everything. Right? But that's just as an adoption for the sake of arguing for a practical model today of re-implementing the Khilafah. But apart from that, I steer far clear from any matters of ikhtilaf amongst the Muslim Ummah.
Yeah, mashallah, eloquently stated, and mashallah, I think that's an extremely mature disposition and orientation to have. May Allah bless you and the work that you do. Switching gears a little bit, we had coincidentally sort of released some things about human rights, and human rights is one of the dominant frames that occupies bodies and minds, to say nothing of international law and policy these days. Now, when I presented sort of a workshop deconstructing human rights at ICNA Mass Convention some time briefly ago, the first thing I did is I told everyone to close their eyes, and I asked them a question. I said, raise your hands if you think that universal rights are applicable to everybody and generally a good thing. And this was young Muslim audience, probably 30 and under, and probably around half, I'd say 50% of people raised their hands. And so I said, great, well, that means that I have a purpose in speaking here today, and we proceeded forth. But it goes to show sort of diagnostically that there are many people that are committed Muslims. They pray 5 times a day. They are Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. They have normative sort of Islamic identity and faith. Yet they think that human rights is something that is neutral, is something that is universally applicable, and is something that is generally good. What would you say in response to such a person?
I'd say, I'd say don't believe the propaganda that arose after World War II by the victorious Western nations. But I'd say beware anyone who argues that their values and ideas are universal. Obviously, except for those who are Muslim and who believe in the Deen of Islam, because, well, when the creator of the entire universe decrees something, then it pretty much is quite literally universal, right? But anyone who declares man-made things to be universal, that should raise very serious red flags with us. The one obvious argument is that anyone could make is that no one agrees with what human rights means. Human rights is something that people can invoke simply based on imagination. I have a human right that for my pronouns to be mandatorily recognized by anyone I demand of. So they must use my pronoun. That's my human rights. Sorry, according to which book of Revelation did you receive? Which engraving on stone, ancient engraving are you relating to refer to our rights here? That seems to be universal and ancient, whatever. Well, no, they just made it up. It reminds me of the story of the king who has no clothes. I don't know if you know this story.
Oh yeah, very famous.
To paraphrase and simplify the story, so basically, the king goes to a tailor. The tailor kind of is scamming the king in a sense, and pretends to sew something, pretends to sew a garment, but the king can't see anything, and then he puts it on the king, so to speak, and the king's like, "This is nothing. I don't see anything." Well, he looks, he can't see anything, and then the tailor says, "It's a special threads, special clothes. These clothes are like magical. Only those people who are truly worthy can see it." So the king doesn't want to look like he's not worthy. So he goes, "Oh, yes, very nice clothes. Thank you very much." And he goes walking down the street in the parade or what have you. And everyone, and then, it gets told that these are special clothes that only people worthy of their station can see. And so everyone then pretends, "Oh, yeah, very nice clothes, very nice clothes." But the reality is the king is walking down completely naked in public. And that's very much a kind of a metaphor for human rights, which is if we all pretend that a particular right exists based on someone's declaration, then we all just go along with the pretense. But it is a pretense. It is something that was just simply concocted, and it changes over time. If you could take the most avid human rights defender, wokest of woke individuals, as I say, referring to modern neo-Marxist movements, and you take their videos and then let's say you put into a time capsule for 20 years and you open it up in 20 years' time, and the people who see that will say, oh, this person's such an intolerant bigot or is a big bigot. They're clearly against these human rights of things that never was even conceived of in their time. So that is basically what happens in the West, is that it gets changed because, it's like fiat currency, paper money. The bank can just print out more and print out new denominations and with new engravings on it, new design, and people just accept it. But even though it's devalued because it could be just printed up, it has its artificial value, but it only has value because we all pretend that it does, and that is the best metaphor for human speculated rights.
That's excellent. So in a nutshell, like the critique that you're putting forth right here is that foundationally, right, human rights is coming from human effort and human intellectual output, and therefore it's literally and categorically impossible that it could be universal, okay, because for various reasons, through time and through space. And we see, actually, all you have to do, you can empirically observe this if you only just pay attention to the unfolding of history. The human rights that people thought that they were entitled to, say, in 1945, are very different from the human rights that people thought they were entitled to in 1985, are very, very different from the human rights people are claiming to be entitled to in 2023, which is already a condemnation that this is not really a universal thing. If it had been universal, then it should have been unchanging and it should have been equally applicable to everybody. So that's a very important critique. What else do you have any other thoughts? I have my own sort of thoughts. I approach it in sort of a different way, but what are other sort of angles of critique that people need to really understand about human rights and the human rights frame? Because it's like everything in these days, like it's presented so beautifully, right? It's like, who could possibly be opposed to human rights? Like, what sort of barbarian are you, right? And so for a lot of people, it's very, very difficult to get through and get past that sort of beautification, how it's been attached to all these people, and the pageantry of being enshrined in the United Nations and international law. And there's all these sorts of, like you said, the emperor's new clothes. There's all these sorts of pageantry and ceremony around it that gives it sort of credibility. So are there any other sort of lines of critique that you'd like to open specifically about human rights, as somebody should say, okay, not only is it the effort of human labor and therefore is going to be by definition limited and not universal, but there are other sort of very fundamental things that are wrong with thinking that this is the frame that we should advocate for what we want?
Yeah. Well, I want to make clear that there's a difference between believing in rights for humans and what the West understands as human rights. So everyone, every deen out there, all the different adyan that are out there, they all believe in particular rights for human beings. But we all differ as to what those rights are. In essence, human rights is like a propaganda buzzword used usually by liberals to refer to their rights as being universal. It's much like, for example, the Catholic Church. I'll give an example. So often people don't understand what the word "katolikos" means. Right? It's a Catholic, with the origin of the word, and it means universal. Funnily enough, because then the nickname, what they call themselves, wasn't just we're just the Church of Rome. No, they are to translate it for Muslim, I suppose, the universal Jama'ah, right? The church means, from ecclesia, means Jama'ah, like a gathering community, congregation. So they made themselves out to be universal, but there was rival, Christian sects out there. But they declared themselves, no, we're the universal ones. And so, you just accept it. Of course, the Eastern Orthodox, they call themselves Orthodoxa, which also means saying that they are of correct belief or right belief. So everyone gives themselves fancy names. As the Quran says, they all refer to themselves with these fancy names.
Illa asma'un, right?
Yeah.
Just names you've made up for yourself.
Yeah, of course. Liberalism, you could say, as a particular religion, amongst others, has given itself this kind of universal name. The Soviet Union, who were Marxists, ostensibly anyway, they actually were hesitant to sign the United Nations Human Rights Declaration because they thought it was a capitalist bourgeois document, guaranteeing things which in capitalism are considered to be human rights, such as the right to private ownership, the ownership of properties which give wealth, like, for example, owning your own farm. A Marxist would say that is not a human right. That deprives the people of wealth-producing properties, which should be commonly owned by everybody. So they would disagree of that as a human right, even though they're also materialist. So this is one of the angles we should criticize, is that it's not universal because not everyone can agree. Heck, even liberals don't agree on rights within liberalism. There's a famous joke about liberal ethical philosophers and things like this, which is the only thing that they can agree on is the word liberalism, and that's it, because they disagree with anything else. So the idea that there's human rights, and the fact that you can interpret, for example, the human rights document any which way, even if you adopt the United Nations kind of concoction there, it could be interpreted in so many ways that so many countries actually signed up to it only because it was so broad or or allowed so much variation that they could get away with whatever they were believing in the first place. There was loopholes that allowed you to kind of put aside or limit certain rights for what is necessary for a state or a quote unquote democratic society.
Yes. No, that was actually one of the slides of my presentation, showing the discrepancy between the so-called sort of right in the UN Charter to religious freedom and practice. And then you scroll down to, I forget which article, 30, 31 or something like that, where it basically says all the rights are limited by the state according to public order and public morality. What are the sort of dictates of the nation state? So very disappointing. A supposedly universal, bold, ostensibly document about the human spirit, we're still trapped in the nation state to recognize and create, sort of enforce those rights, which is another sort of important. Yes, go ahead.
I'll tell you something that might shock you. So when France implemented the hijab ban in schools, some Muslims took France to court in the European Court of Human Rights, saying that this undermines their religious freedom, religious rights. And the French Republic relied upon, I think it's Article 29, which said that you can limit rights in accordance with what is deemed to be necessary for protection of morals and the functioning of a democratic society. It was argued by French Republic successfully, and the court ruled in favor of France that they were not in breach of quote unquote the human rights because they were implementing restrictions that were deemed required for the functioning of a democratic society, quote unquote. And France said, we're a secular society and we're aiming to protect people from religion. So that's our secularism, is to protect people from being coerced or forced by religion. So our schools must be neutral, and so on and so forth. And that passed in favor. So intolerance against Muslims practicing their deen was accepted as part of human rights.
Yeah, no, that's,
and there are similar other cases. Sorry,
I said that's not shocking to me at all. That's actually very on brand. Talal Asad, in a footnote of one of his books, he pointed out the history of the term crimes against humanity. I thought was also very telling, is that the first use of the term crimes against humanity was actually instituted in the treaty, I don't speak French, so I can't pronounce it, of Sèvres, that sort of carved up the Ottoman Empire. And basically they had, as I'm sure you're aware, had apportioned parts of Anatolia to different European powers. They were planning on giving some to the UK and some to Greece and some to Italy and whatnot. And they were preparing sort of the language of the treaty in order to justify this land grab. Of course, we know historically what happened. Mustafa Kemal sort of fought back at Gallipoli and won, and actually, got the sort of the borders. The colonial plan never happened. But in their justification, they were pointing to Armenia and the sort of, their alleged atrocities against Armenians, and they used the language crimes against Christendom. Okay, but at that point, I believe it was France that intervened and said, wait a second, we can't say that, because if we do, it's going to be Islam against Christianity. We have a lot of Muslim colonies, Algeria, etc. And so they changed the language from crimes against Christendom to crimes against humanity. And so we see that humanity is merely just, again, asma'un sammaytumuha, words with no content really, that's really a euphemism for the Christian European self. And that the concern that animated the use of this term was a particular subject, not a universal subject, a particular subject, which was the European Christian. But we can't, in polite society, say that anymore. So we have to use the word, the terms of the crimes against humanity and human rights in order to sort of disguise the partisan nature of the regime of rights. I found that absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, as I said, as soon as Muslims adopt the word human rights and argue from that basis to non-Muslims, you're already conceding that, in this particular case, liberalism really is the arbiter of what is good and bad, and therefore you must argue on their basis. Now, I would say that the best approach is simply you can argue to non-Muslims that you say, well, like you guys say you believe in X, Y, and Z particular rights, and look how you contradict yourself on these matters. I also give an example from the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala argues that, has Allah preferred for you sons and taken for himself daughters, because the Quraysh believed that it was a big shame for someone to have their firstborn child to be a female, and they preferred males. And of course, if a man had only female daughters, this was the worst shame of them all. And yet they ascribed it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not, justifying this particular idea. It's simply pointing out the inconsistency, the hypocrisy in their own belief systems. They're happy to do this, and which is also shirk, by the way, to do this to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to ascribe to him only daughters, and he's the highest upon high. And yet for humans, it's considered to be, oh no, we can only have sons, of course, because having daughters is really bad. So this is how we one of the ways I've suggested and how I've engaged non-Muslim advocates of quote unquote human rights. I often say I use their own ideas to show reduction ad absurdum, but also to show the contradictions, how they behave inconsistently with it, how it in of itself it is inconsistent, and then I can say now the Deen of Islam is consistent. It offers consistent sets of rights.
That's an extremely profound point about how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses that sort of line of argumentation. There's a group of verses in Surah Al-Ma'idah, I'm sure you're familiar with, that Christians and Jews sort of always refer to as indicating that their religions are valid and remain valid. And those are the sort of verses where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is sort of claiming or basically issuing a literal imperative for them to follow what's in their books. However, in the context is exactly what you're mentioning. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually blaming them for their hypocrisy, because they were coming to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam for rulings, and they were choosing them when they wanted, when it suited them, and then abandoning them when it didn't suit them. And so the context of this verse, or these groups of verses, is actually pointing out that hypocrisy, is that they're not really looking to follow the guidance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends. They're only trying to game it and cheat and follow whatever they want. There's another interesting sort of line. So when I had sort of had my presentation and subsequent sort of gave it at our local masjid, the entry point that I use to critique human rights, beyond everything that you've mentioned, is the definition of what is a human being. That's implicit. Is that a lot of people, when they talk about human rights, they focus immediately on the rights. And that's fine, because as you said, the rights are mutually contradictive. Nobody agrees on what they are. People have different conceptions about what they should feel entitled to as rights. But the definition of who is a human being in the first place completely determines our idea of what we think we're entitled to in terms of rights. And so if you have a secular definition of a human being, right, that the human being is material, matter, that's it, and they only have this life, there is no God, there is no afterlife, or at least they're not essential. You might believe in that as part of your culture and your heritage and tradition and things like that, but we're not taking it ontologically seriously, that it's actually exists. The things that I think I'm entitled to are vastly different than a person who believes in the afterlife. They believe in a creator, they believe in heaven and hell, right? If you're somebody who's a materialist and your definition of a human being is materialist, then this is all you have. This life is your one shot. You only live once, they say. And so now to be deprived of any opportunity, whether that opportunity is to sort of self-actualize, to be called by your pronouns, to have sex with whoever you want to have it with, to own anything or to experience anything, is seen as a crime of the highest order, because you're taking away the enjoyment from the one chance that this person has in their existence. Whereas if your calculus is based on the fact that this isn't your real life, right? Your real life starts the moment that your soul is extracted from your body, you go down to the grave, you experience either punishment or bliss in the grave, and then you await resurrection, you're going to be resurrected, and then you're going to be judged. The entire calculus of what you think that you're entitled to completely changes. You're not entitled to those sorts of opportunities here on earth. You actually have to restrict your desires and things like that and live within a certain frame so that you're successful in the next realm. So it's very, very important. Language is extremely important. And many of these debates and these battles are fought on what we call things. You see that the LGBTQ movement has been unfortunately successful with how they've shaped the language of the debate to talk about things in terms of homosexual or heterosexual is already something that puts us on the back foot and shifts the terrain against us. To talk about, love is love and, love wins, and it's all just all this sort of thing has put us on the defense and in a very sort of compromised position. So we say human, and everybody thinks we're talking about the same thing, but we're actually talking about completely different things. You and I believe in one type of human being, very, very different from the type of human being that a materialist or a secularist believes in. And people need to think about that more, I think, more critically when they consider or they imagine that human rights is something that's going to benefit them.
Oh no, totally. The foundational principle of what the West calls human rights is the liberal model of human beings, which arguably it dates back to, I suppose, John Locke, although you could say Thomas Hobbes inadvertently set the groundwork for it, which is in essence, some academics call this possessive individualism, which is you are an individual human who owns their own body. And I noticed that you mentioned that too during your lecture, that this understanding, this underpinning kind of foundation behind human rights is that the individual owns themselves. And then from that basis, then good and bad is determined by what the individual consents their body to be used for, or what consents what to do with their body, and to some extent their property of the earth, which was left a bit ambiguous by John Locke and led to later ikhtilaf as to who owns the earth and who owns the resources, and debates between the Marxists and liberals and conservatives on ownership. But everyone, there's ijma across these different schools of thought as to the individual owns their own body. So that's the agreement. You could say it's the Enlightenment, quote unquote, the Enlightenment ideal. So based on that premise, then consent is the furqan of good and bad, of halal haram in their viewpoint. And as Muslims, obviously, we must critique this initial basis. If we just accept that as the basis, then we have to accept everything that comes with it. So many Muslims, and I think you again pointed this out in your lecture as well, that they say, my body, my choice, so let me wear the hijab, for example. And I say, okay, great, all right, fine. But then you can't be in moral opposition to people who want to engage in same-sex intercourse or extramarital intercourse, premarital intercourse, because it's their body, their choice. And if you think that this only has political ramifications, some people have imbibed it into a kind of religious principles. So, have you ever wondered why secular liberalism is called secular liberalism? And why isn't that a tautology? Because liberalism is secular. Why you call it secular liberalism? That's because it has a twin brother called religious liberalism, and that's when you just take the same principle and you apply it into religion. So you'll see liberal Reform Judaism and liberal Christians. They will argue that what sends you to hell is not that you don't worship the Creator or you happen to be an atheist or what have you. It's only if you rape people, if you commit murder, but all the things that liberalism itself condemns. As long as you're a good person, which just means more sociable, maybe, and that you respect, and that you respect everybody's consensual choices, then that gets you into heaven, regardless of your religion. And so religious liberals, whichever flavor of religion they claim or label, vestigial remnant of religion they claim to be from, they all will agree. And you'll find this with those who still call themselves Muslim, but they have adopted religious liberalism. They agree. They would argue that all religions are a path to God, that it's not a problem whether you kind of do zina or what have you, as long as you're a good person, as long as it was consensual, God will understand, or what have you. And they will change their religion. So the principles are not just political principles, but because these principles, once you adopt them, and eventually humans will universalize. Humans will always universalize whatever inside themselves, whatever principles they adopt. They don't compartmentalize. Okay, I'm only going to be liberal in my political my understanding of politics, but I won't be liberal in my theology. No. If you adopt principles, it's human nature that you begin to universalize them. And if they're false, then the falsehood will encompass all of your worldview. And so that is an issue that I've noticed. So yes, if we engage with non-Muslims on the issue of demanding our rights, it shouldn't be because our body, our choice, but rather you can make 2 points. One is that as Muslims, we are Islamically obliged to worship the Creator. There is no other meaning to human life other than submission to the Creator, which really is just an acknowledgement of reality itself. And we acknowledge it with our actions, our tongue, our hearts. That's really what submission means. Yeah. And so our deen, our belief compels us to do this, right? As one prophet said in the Quran, our salah, as his people said, our salah compels us to do this, right? Our submission to the Creator, our worship of Him. But you guys claim X, Y, and Z. You guys say that we're allowed to do this, and now you are being hypocritical to your own principles here. And then that's the means we hold them to account. There is a verse in the Quran, which I'm sure you're aware, which is just dispute not with the people of the book unless you witness them committing injustice. But the thing is, if in this particular case, injustice refers to not following the Quran and Sunnah, well, they don't, because they're Christians and Jews, and of course they don't follow the Quran and Sunnah. But what does it then mean? Well, it means that they're not being consistent to the principles they claim they adopt. Because if someone's principled, you can say, well, they might be wrong, but at least they're being sincere to their principles, and maybe they're just ignorant. But if they're hypocritical, then this is nifaq, right? This is not them being principled. And subhanAllah, you see Ibn Taymiyyah and Imam Ghazali discussing other civilizations who weren't Muslim, and how they had longevity because they were consistent applying the principles. Imam Ghazali brought the Persian Empire as an example, that they had longevity because not because they were applying the Sharia or because they were believers in the Deen and Haqq, but only because whatever misguided ideas they believed in, they were consistent applying it. And so then people were not going to be angry, because they will say, well, okay, at least you're applying it consistently, then we can't argue against that. So that's what I would argue is what the Quran is kind of advising us to do. Well, not advising us, it's commanding us to do that. Don't dispute the people of the book unless you they commit injustice to their principles, basically.
That's a crucial point, and it's dawned on me in the last year or two that there seems to be a significant divide between people of principle, or the concept of principle, versus identity. And I think that especially the first couple chapters of the Quran, Al-Baqarah and Al-Imran, can be read as a call to principle and a call away from identity. It's almost to shift a little bit to another thing, similar to the consent argument. And obviously, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala problematizes the idea of consent in Surah Al-Baqarah, where he says, perhaps you might like a thing and it's bad for you, and perhaps you might dislike a thing and it's good for you. Well, there goes your consent right there. So there, in a similar way, we have adopted the language of identity, and there's a couple ways in which that can be decent. Yes, you want to identify yourself with a righteous Muslim sort of either mentor or a figure or a model to pattern your behavior off of, to sort of comport yourself to. That makes sense, but identity has severe limitations for how we are sort of conceptualizing ourselves as individuals and this whole thing that we're supposed to be doing. And it seems to me that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala criticizes Bani Israel and then the Christians after them for this departure from following principles to forming an identity around their sort of, basically what they did was Allah sent them a prophet, or in the case of Bani Israel, multiple prophets. And instead of realizing that the whole point was, are you going to be people of principle? You're going to follow the guidance wherever you find it. You're going to listen to Allah's commands wherever you find it. They converted it into an identity of, well, we are God's chosen people. That's who we are. Now we are saved due to who we are, our identity. And that was something that actually set them up to fail the ultimate test, which is what happens when another prophet comes, or another prophet is sent outside of your tribe, or sent to a group of people that you consider outside of your in-group. Now you've set yourself up for kufr, because you have ceased to be a person of principle. If you had been a person of principle, you would have followed the truth wherever you found it. You've become a person of identity, and your sense of identity is somewhat misplaced or around the wrong things. And so you are going to do whatever you have to do to preserve this identity that you've structured and built for yourself, at the expense of following the truth and at the expense of following Allah's guidance. I'm not sure. I'm sure you could add to that when it comes to identity.
Well, unfortunately, it is a common human trait, asabiyya, which means in Fusha, like groupism, I suppose. And by groupism, not that you have groups, organizations. No, it's I suppose best delineated by the term, my country, right or wrong, right. My group, right or wrong. And there's many ahadith by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam who kind of defined or explained to us what asabiyya is. Asabiyya is to support your group, your people in wrong and in oppression when they are not in the right. And that's very interesting, because if you only support people when they're in the right, then your cause was always going to be righteousness, and it will never be then based on quote unquote whatever gives worldly power to your group or group interests. And it reminds me of, well, as I said, there's a hadith about, that, hikmah is the lost property of the believer. And, many non-Muslims, those who don't have revelation, can be right sometimes. They said a broken clock is right twice a day, right?
Right.
And so, Abraham Lincoln famously said, I don't care if God's on my side, as long as I'm on his side, right? And so, but that's something that a Muslim, of course, we believe anyway, which is we have to care about whether what we're doing is correct, even if it means that we have to reprimand our friends, we have to face some hard truths about those who even did favors for us. And they come calling for a favor, say, brother, I did this for you. Could you help me in this situation? And you say, but it's not right what you're doing. So, brother, look, I helped you. Are you going to be ungrateful now? I say, well, no, but I can't be ungrateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala instead. And that's really the mentality that as Muslims we need to we need to adopt. I want to make 2 points before I forget them, because they just occurred to me. So I hope you don't mind. I'll backtrack very quickly.
Yeah, of course.
I try to kind of give Muslims intellectual ammunition to fight some of these discussions. And so when it comes to the issue of ownership, when you discuss we own ourselves, is what materialists argue. Mm-hmm. You can attack it from one angle, which I usually do, which is say, did you create yourself so as to own yourself? Or in some cultures, it was believed that your parents own you because they made you. That was the belief. Mm-hmm. Do you have a bill of sale where you purchased yourself from that which created you?
Pardon me
in order to claim that you have ownership.
Excuse me for laughing, because I had a Christian friend who was a practicing Catholic. He was Puerto Rican, and he used to say to his son, I brought you into this world and I can take you out of this world. And so it just came to mind as an older sort of idea of property. So, but do continue.
Yes, subhanAllah. Now, I use this argument, but then I realized I could go a step further, which is you could challenge any materialist and say, where in the material universe is there the concept of ownership at all? All you have in the universe is matter, energy, and forces. There's gravity. I mean, like, do we say the sun owns us because we're in the sun's gravity well? Does the earth own us because we're in the earth's gravity well? There is no such concept as ownership outside of revelation. Because really, the only thing that ownership means is that from our perspective anyway, or the human understanding of ownership could only ever mean for us that we're given temporary rights, but restricted rights of usage to use ourselves in ways specified by the one who created us. But we don't have absolute right of ownership. Only God has absolute right of ownership, meaning that he controls us fully. And some people say, "Oh, but I can control myself, so surely, I own myself." And you also said this as well in your lecture. I noticed that as well. That some people argue, "I can control myself, so surely I must own myself." I say, "Okay, well then I can go and steal your car, and if I go to court, I say it's all right, judge. I hotwired it, so I was in control, therefore I own it."
Yeah,
right. So that's obviously it's ridiculous. So materialists can't even justify the very concept of ownership, which is not a physical concept, but is what you might call a metaphysical concept beyond the physical, let alone that we own our bodies. Whereas at least as Muslims, we can justify not only that it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that owns us, but that ownership itself is meaningless outside of that context of the creator. And I think the last point I wanted to add, which I was kind of reminded to, and I wanted to say earlier on, and I'll say it very quickly, is I've noticed, and I've noticed for many years, I've debated people who call themselves modernists. So basically, they're just liberals who are from a Muslim background who evangelize to Muslims. That's as simple as that. Yeah. They evangelize liberalism to Muslims, and they use Muslim texts. They do mental gymnastics of Muslim texts to justify. Now they often use the example of the Mu'tazila. They say. These were the rationalists, although Mu'tazila doesn't mean that anyway. It doesn't mean nothing to do with aql, the name anyway. But they believed that morality could be discerned by the aql and didn't require revelation. So that shows that there's some kind of universal morals that can be deduced, and our movement has universal human rights argument, proposition that just coincidentally happens to be completely consistent with 20th century Western ideas of human rights, and now 21st century too, just coincidentally, of course.
Yeah, of course.
So I often point out that, well, you do know that the Mu'tazila, they believed in this, that the Islamic kind of conditions of let's say, well, I suppose you could say, let's say slavery, the treatment of slaves, they didn't believe that it was abolished. They didn't believe that zina should be allowed because it's consensual between. No, they believed it should be punished, even if it is consensual between two adults. They believed that same-sex intercourse is forbidden. They believed they adopted or believed everything that the common ijma of all the Muslims believed for 1,300 years.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, you referred to them because you say that they believed in Aql, and Aql could discern morals, i.e. a universal, timeless set of morals, and yet you disagree with their morals, right? And their morals were completely, in terms of the fiqh anyway, was more or less in line with at least the ijma of the classical scholars, pretty much almost completely, right? So this is a little irony I like to notice, that don't try to anachronistically find people from the back past and say they're your team. They're not your friends. They would condemn you yourselves if they were present.
Yeah, it's a very, very well-known trick. I mean, even how people marshal the Greeks, right? And it's like, how do I always try to bring this up to people who find it distasteful about slavery in the fiqh books, or what we call in English slavery. I would advocate for the need for a further refinement in the terms that we use, because usually we think of chattel slavery when we use the word slavery in English, and that doesn't really adequately describe the system in Islamic law. So, someone comes to Islam, or they encounter Islam, and they're so horrified by the justification of or tolerance of slavery, and yet they look so fondly upon the Greeks, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, who were at least took the existence of slaves for granted and defended it. And actually worse than anything that can be found in Islam, because in Islam there is no slavery of an existential, we could say, type. Like, people don't inherently, due to who they are, deserve to be enslaved. It is sort of a condition where they're prisoners of war. It's a very sort of circumstantial thing. Whereas the Greek philosophers justified slavery as an existential fact, that these people are intended to be slaves. They can be nothing else but slaves. And yet look at the emotional sort of relationship that people have, one to the other, and you see people selectively marshaling the past as it suits them. SubhanAllah.
I mean, just to add a quick kind of a caveat for people listening in, I did a lecture on this, and so I would argue that yes, the English word, and it's an English word. There's no fiqh hukm that says you must use this particular English word to refer to I don't know, you could say ghulamiyya, or use of those who are riq, like
right.
But in Islam, we, people say, surely the condition, which what English people, or in English translation has been currently called slavery, is something which is is viewed to be a negative condition. It's not a pleasant one. I say, well, yeah, of course, liberalism views bankruptcy as a bad condition, and yet it allows bankruptcy to be as a condition, that all people be bankrupt. They'll be labeled as bankrupt. They'll face certain social conditions for being bankrupt, and yet it doesn't abolish it. Right? But every liberal would not want anyone to be in bankruptcy. It's not a great condition to be in, and yet it is allowed due to certain necessities. I'd say the Islamic position is that is also fructus, also fructuary rights. You can use if someone is captured in warfare, you can use them to do labor, but not beyond their capacity. Fructos, to benefit from the fruits of their labor, so you can employ them to do work and make a profit from that work, but not abusos, which is the right to dispose of them, right? But in order to fully own something, you have to have all three rights, which is rights of usos, fructos, and abusos, right? Which is from Latin. But only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has all three rights upon human beings. And so as Muslims, we don't believe that in an absolute sense there is a human being can actually own another human being in an absolute cosmological sense, you could say. But rather it's a name, and riq, meaning to own the neck, right, so to speak, or to hold the neck, or those which your right hands possess, is one of, you have like a temporary control over them. But even the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam forbade us from calling, for saying, my slave, or they call you, master, but they should call you Sayyid, Sayyidina, and things like this, and you should call them Jaria, like my girl or my boy, So this is the kind of, this is the Islamic perspective. I know translating a slave in English then connotes in people's minds that is exactly the same as the Western understanding and also the Greek understanding of slavery, where in certain conditions, you could do whatever you want to your slave. You completely own them. You could abuse them. You could beat them. You could kill them. Right. And the only time the West and in history they ever brought restriction in killing the slaves was because there was slave revolts. There were so many slave revolts because of bad and insane, abusive kind of owners that they wanted to limit that. So they said, okay, guys, right, you can't beat up the slaves like to this degree. You can beat them up, but not to like this degree, or you can't kill them because we want to stop having these slave revolts. But it was more a practical issue, not some universal ethical issue that they derived. And you're right. Aristotle gave one of deemed to be the man who studied made logic the kind of subject of study and was deemed to be very a man of akal, quote unquote, a man of intellect. It just gave a full-blown justification for the natural condition of there being three tiers in society: men, then women, then slaves. And yet, people argue that it's against this universal human rights, such that there can exist coerced, labor or coerced work. And I'll finish this last point. I know I've been dragging on a bit because there's some fun. There's two funny points, and I often try to point this out to everyone who just who maybe be not aware. Everyone knows the 13th Amendment is quite infamous. That slavery actually isn't abolished in the United States of America. It's only abolished for generally people who are free and law-abiding. But if you commit a crime, in theory, the state is within its full right to enslave you as a punishment for crime. Of course, there are some people who made some issues with this. They say, well, that's not fair. And say, okay, well, we'll pay them like 13 cents an hour or something really paltry. To say, it's not technically slavery because we are paying them something. It's just ridiculous what they are paying them. But what's the joke? Is that they're not prisoners. They're not slaves. They're prisoners with jobs, right? That's the joke. But there's also something else that people don't realize is the Third Geneva Convention allows you to compel prisoners of war to do labor, right? Why is that not called slavery? That's called compelled labor, right? And yet Islam pretty much does the same thing with from the standard understanding of fiqh, which is captives of war. Can't do labor, but there's restrictions of what you can make them do. And Geneva Convention does the same thing. So why is it that Islam is deemed to be quote unquote barbaric, but the Geneva Convention is deemed to be modern and enlightened and civilized? So
Well done. That's excellent stuff. And man, subhanAllah, the time has flown, and I feel like we could have probably multiple discussions just like this. I think two of the things that crystallized for me in this entire discussion is that Muslims are people of principle, and we should demand that other people be consistent. And I think that dovetails really well with the sort of strategy and tactics that you use in a debate, as well as in your own life, right? We demand principles from ourselves, and we demand ourselves to be consistent, and we demand that of other people too. And if not, then we're definitely going to find it and point it out.
Inshallah. But I will caveat to that I aspire to be a person of principle. I am keenly aware of the mountain of my mistakes I've done.
All of us.
And all I can hope to do is to continue the project of changing myself, to align with Allah's decree and to be a consistent worshipper of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in all and every facet of the obligations that have been obliged upon me.
I mean, for you and me and everybody watching as well. Beautiful words, and I think appropriate ones to end on. Abdullah Andalusi, thank you so much for joining us for today. I really look forward to meeting you in person, inshallah, soon. And hopefully before then, we can have some further discussion. Barakallahu feekum.
Wa iyaakum. Thanks for having me on.